looks are often deceiving. We meet people, they're unassuming, they're very quiet, but we don't really know about the profound thought that's going on between their ears. Likewise with books. Some books might not have the flashiest cover, but they certainly have many truths to share with us. And likewise, even in the opposite sense. What can a superhero movie, a summer blockbuster, teach us about life? Well, it turns out quite a lot. Full disclosure, I'm not somebody who's massively into the Marvel Universe. I just picked up this film on the recommendation of a friend, because he thought that he'd seen some very interesting things in it, and he thought that I could do a lot with that. So that's why I'm watching this. If I am missing any sort of information, which my conclusions would be nullified by, then feel free to let me know. Because I'm talking about this film in utter isolation with some information from a couple of friends, but I haven't seen all of the films. I just thought that this particular one was very interesting. So we'll start with the basic premise. You have Thanos, big purple guy for those who don't know, who wants to destroy half of all life to stop essentially ecological destruction, and he is travelling across the universe to find 6 stones, which would enable him to have the power to do so, and the Avengers, coupled with the Guardians of the Galaxy, have to stop him. That's the basic idea. Now, I'm going to be spoiling parts of this film. It's kind of impossible to talk about a film in any great detail and what we can learn from it without spoiling things, so consider yourself warned.
Pange lingua gloriosi, corporis mysterium.
So to begin with, I think it's important to talk about the goodies and the baddies. For those who don't know, the goodies are the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy, pretty obviously. And then you have the baddies, who are basically Thanos and his underlings, because it wouldn't be really fair to call them friends. Because you can draw a lot of interesting parallels to our society from how these different groups work and the assumptions that are going behind everything that's going on. So we'll start with Thanos and the baddies, right? Now, to give them a short title, they're essentially reason without any sort of moral feeling. It's moral reasoning without any sort of moral feeling. For example, Thanos himself, he behaves in a very patriarchal way with Gamora, his stepdaughter. He's rigidly hierarchical with everyone else in his little group below him. He's seemingly very indifferent to suffering, although obviously he suffers himself, right? There's a certain sympathy that many people had for Thanos, and that is one of the reasons why he seems to be indifferent to suffering, but he feels it very distinctly himself. There's a lot of talk about destiny that comes out of his mouth, which I found very interesting. He's also got some incredibly arrogant followers. Very somber in tone as well. And the one principle that underlies all which Thanos pursues is a single moral principle which lacks an understanding of life having a certain sanctity to it. And consequently, there's kind of a lack of affection. So now on to the goodies, the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy. These people seem to despise suffering to such a point that it will override their reason. There's a complete disregard for authority, as is demonstrated when Thor ends up on the ship with the Guardians. There's a trend of very collapsed, very loose family structures that I think a lot of people in the audience can very much relate to. I think that the people who made the film made a very conscious effort to make both sides very relatable. There's also a attempt to be funny, but it seems to kind of be misplaced, right? The film can't decide whether or not it's a comedy or serious. And it's probably trying to balance the film for as many audiences as possible, but personally I thought it felt kind of flat. It's absolutely bathed in the current culture, and it's also nostalgic, which is something that characterizes modern Western culture very strongly, regardless of where you find yourself socially, politically, and even religiously. This nostalgic feeling and this reference to popular culture is almost everywhere, and there's no exception in the protagonists of this film. They also possess this vague spirituality, this vague good feeling. I would call it a religion, but it's not explicit enough to be a religion. The whole thing is overwhelmingly emotional, and there's no real formal hierarchy to it. And I think that's what affects most people's lives nowadays. I think a lot of people live that sort of life, and they can't necessarily see the benefit of what Thanos brings to the table as well. But that's kind of beside the point, because you've got two camps here. But the one thing that I noticed they shared in common, that I'll get onto later on, is that they both can't distinguish between authority and power. There's no distinction with either of them. Thanos just seems to be waging a war to destroy half of life for the sake of preventing suffering, because he's taken it upon himself. And you sort of see it manifest in his underlings, how they behave very arrogantly. This assumption, this usurpation of authority, because Thanos does indeed have the power, and therefore he has the authority. And it seems as if the Avengers act in a similar way. There's a undermining more explicitly of authority, of course, back in the ship when you have Thor just doing as he will against Star-Lord's wishes. You see this kind of omnipresently, but that's because this is a thing that's been in Western culture for centuries. But it still needs to be talked about, and so I will. And both sides are very relatable. It seems like it parallels American society very strongly. But more than that, the reason why people find it so relatable is because it's quasi-religious in nature, both sides. Both sides are taking inspirations from different traditions of religion. That's why people are so strongly attached, and they are so... they fanboy so hard over the Avengers. It's because it's an incredibly religious film. And we'll explain what kinds of groups that these two attitudes fit into. The Thanos, the baddies, and the goodies. Because it's clear that the baddies are trying to represent this Americana view. This fundamentally, specifically reformed Christian view of society. This view of the Puritans, this view of John Calvin, this view of John Knox. For those who don't know, these are theologians from about 500 years ago. I'll reference them a lot. This is what built American society. Also, people like John Locke and, of course, the Founding Fathers, and they all ultimately came from this tradition of Reformed Christianity, which is ultimately very fideistic. If you ask the average Presbyterian, for example, why is the Bible inerrant? Why those particular works? Why the 66 books in the Protestant canon? Why those books? Most of them won't be able to give you an answer. If you tell them that the contents page isn't divinely inspired, they won't be able to give you an answer. And Thanos kind of parallels that, right? Because he's ultimately well-meaning, but at least in the progressive view, which we'll get onto in a second, it's based on flawed premises. But frankly, the goodies are a lot more interesting, right? Because the Calvinistic Americana attitude, this attack on essentially Protestantism, has been going on for at least 60 years in America in earnest, but honestly for a lot longer than that. The goodies, the good attitude, which is the thing that I'm going to focus on, or the quote-unquote good attitude, the thing I'm going to focus on the most in this attitude is something much more ancient. Something that has been pressed throughout American society since maybe the late 19th century, but it's been present throughout history. The book that I'd recommend you guys read on that strain of human behaviour would be Against Heresies by Saint Irenaeus of Lyon. This book was written at the close of the 2nd century, whereas John Calvin was writing at the beginning of the 16th. So, to give you an idea of which one is more ancient, it's undeniably the strain that is in progressive politics and in the attitude of the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy. And that's why it's so much more important to talk about it. Also, the clash between the two is a false dichotomy. It's not something that exists, because there are alternatives that make a lot more sense with reality, that both incorporate the moral feeling and the moral reason, as well as producing families in a way that doesn't terrify the stepdaughters, while simultaneously allowing people some wiggle room to be human. And we'll be discussing that at length today. We're going to be speaking specifically about 3 different things throughout this video. First of all, we'll be talking about the attitudes towards love, which are incredibly important. The second, we'll be talking about family, marriage, and friendship in the movie. And then finally, we'll be talking about the attitude towards suffering. I think that we all know that love makes the world go round. It sustains all things. It creates all things. But how is it presented in the Avengers? What can we see in this movie? What does it tell us about it? Well, let's consider how utterly sensitive love is in the Avengers. It's always expressed in some very sensual way. There's always touching or a particular kind of glare. I think we all know that kind of glare. Kissing, sweet words, and also one of the most kind of frustrating parts of the film for me is how they couldn't stand to see the other person suffer. And so they would give access to the stone to Thanos, which is something that, of course, goes against the dictate of reason. Because, of course, if that person dies, then, the whole thing is game over. If you just say no to Thanos, then he can't destroy half of life. But because I assume in the modern mindset would say love, people can just, of course, dole out that information to stop the suffering. In fact, one of the most painfully irritating expressions of this sensitive kind of love that is something that I think is very present today in the real world is that it just seems kind of fine that Gamora tells Star-Lord to kill her if Thanos gets to her. And in order to explain why this is so wrong, we have to first talk about a very important thinker called Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was the abbot or head of a monastery in the 12th century, and he's incredibly important. He wrote a lot of things about love. He was very, very fascinated with the subject. In fact, some of his works are in the description along with all of the other citations that I'm going to give here. He was fascinated with love, and he wrote a lot about it, because God is love. But how is this applicable to the film? Well, because Saint Bernard, the honey-worded doctor as he's often called, wrote about 4 stages in which love develops in human beings. You don't hear much about that every day. So the very first stage, which is arguably the innate stage of most human beings ever born, is what he calls cupidity, which is loving other people and loving God for your sake alone. So a very selfish kind of love. I think we've all felt it at some point for somebody that we love purely for the sake of our own gain. Be it for sex, be it for alcohol, be it for anything. We love them for our own sake. The second stage is where we move more towards a true charity, which is the willing of the good of the other person, or God himself. That's what charity is. And this is where we begin to love people and God for the sake of the blessing that they give us. So they provide us of a source of virtue. They allow us to develop as human beings in an objectively good sense. They provide us with information that we might need to travel throughout the world, and they're a legitimate comfort to be around, not for the sake of their gratification of our ego, but because they are good in themselves and we recognise that. And the third stage, which we achieve in this life, is the love of God for his own sake, and the love of people for God's sake, because God made man, and man is in his image, and so we love them. And the final stage, which is one that we don't obtain until we go to heaven, is the fourth stage, which is where we love ourselves for God's sake, because in heaven all is perfect, we are perfect, and therefore we are perfect likenesses of God, and therefore we love God completely. And so we love ourselves. Now, before I attack the characters in a very rash way, I want to make 2 things clear. Earlier on, I didn't make it clear that charity is to be applied to all people. This is referring to all people. Secondly, I understand that the characters are under stress. In fact, when someone was checking my script, they asked me if I'd make that clear. Because frankly, almost all of the characters, as far as I can tell, are stuck in that first stage. The only person who even comes close to the second stage is Vision, and even then he's a robot. The Guardians and the Avengers are both unable to stomach watching the suffering of their friends at all. And so, numerous times, and I think this is there deliberately as a demonstration of weakness, they are unable to say, I can stand this person suffering because I will the good of all of the rest of life. And instead they cave. Gamora is particularly bad when she asks Star-Lord to kill her if she's caught by Thanos, which is something that's tremendously selfish, because she's just turned around and told her lover to kill her if she's caught. She's asking her lover to do something that is gravely wrong, because it's essentially murder. She's asked her lover to murder her if she's caught by her stepdad, which is something that is tremendously inconsiderate. Can you imagine asking a family member of yours to kill you if you were in an unpleasant situation like that? Can you imagine that? Wouldn't that be somewhat inconsiderate? Wouldn't it be better? Wouldn't it be more loving to suffer through it on your own? But no, this isn't considered. And the second time, when Gamora sees her sister being splayed out and floating, and she's torn apart by Thanos, and she caves and she gives him the information on where the stone is. That bit is particularly annoying because she doesn't have control over herself to the point where she considers the good of, well, half of all life to be better than the suffering of her sister, which obviously one is much bigger than the other, especially since she comes from a planet where half of the people were wiped out by Thanos. Surely she should know the potential implications of her doing that, but nope, she just does it anyway. Which leads me to say that, especially in her case, it's first tier. In fact, every single time, and you see this quite a lot in this film, whenever you see a character cave to their emotions or to any particular suffering, you're witnessing an instance of profound pride. Because these people cannot tolerate seeing one person suffer for the sake of half of all life. And they're so transfixed with watching the suffering, be it their own or be it the other characters, that they're unable to say, right, I'm going to sit here and I'm going to suffer through it. The closest that you see is Loki, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. A good counter to this is the person of Jael, who's written about in the 4th chapter of the book of Judges in the Bible. So for those who aren't aware of the story, there was an evil king called Sisera, who was in control of the Canaanites but also had oppressed the Israelites for 2 decades, a little bit over 2 decades. And he is defeated in battle by 2 of the tribes of Israel. And all of his men except for him are killed. And he flees to the tent of Jael. And Jael is sort of semi-neutral. She is of the religion of the Israelites, but she's not directly involved in the war. So what she does is she gives him some milk, lies him down to sleep, and then she drives a tent spike through his head. Now, is that not murder, I hear you saying? Well, think about it, right? She's protecting her own right to life and the right of her co-religionists to live, who have been viciously oppressed by this king for 2 decades. And although he has been defeated in battle, there's no reason why he can't just go and get another army. She's protecting her people, first of all, and second of all, this man had done many vicious evils as well against children. Like, he would sacrifice babies to his idols. She is protecting the right to life that those babies have by killing him. And so it shouldn't really be thought of as a murder as much as a preservation of life. Because he would go on and murder thousands of more if she didn't do that. And he already had. That's why she's often compared to the Virgin Mary and Sisera to the devil. Now, how exactly can we obtain this charity, this love of all people, above this cupidity which we have in the beginning that we've described? Well, it's very simple. We obtain it through prayer and through the sacraments of the Catholic Church. We cannot on our own develop these habits by ourselves. We need God. We need the Church. This is what it provides. And I'll provide a link in the description to go into more detail about charity for those who are interested. Another extremely important pillar that supports this film is the attitude towards family and friends. Because it's something that has changed for the worse over the last 60 years. There's been a collapse in the family. There's been a reduction in social trust and a breakdown of friendship. I think this was done intentionally by the people who made this film because it's very relatable. Of course, everybody throughout history has had family problems, but especially now, we are suffering from a breakdown of the family which hasn't been seen that much in history. In modern times, even marriages are devolved into these exchanges of legal rights with some affection thrown in, and friendships are often formed because it's mutually beneficial to be friends at a given time, as opposed to the end of friendship in itself. And of course we see this in the film, but in order to go over friendship, we ought to have a pretty good idea of what friendship is, because although we may intuitively know what love is, we may intuitively know what friendship is, we need a certain framework by which to judge it, because when things are intuitive, they're not precise, necessarily. They often subvert our expectations. And so we're going to enter another figure, a person who knew St. Bernard of Clairvaux, called St. Aelred of Rievaulx, another saint, who wrote a book on friendship called Spiritual Friendship, in which he describes ideal friendship and how to maintain and obtain them. This will be linked in the description as well. It's 120 pages. It's well worth the read. Now, he defines friendship as this: mutual harmony in affairs human and divine, coupled with benevolence and charity. So, basically, we have to have something in common in both the way we're living our lives, but also our beliefs. And also, they need to be coupled with benevolence, which is, of course, a certain level of kindness, and charity, which is the love of all men for the sake of God, on some level at least. He also defines three kinds of friendship. He talks about evil friendships, which are based on evil, which have the commonality and maybe a semblance of benevolence. But ultimately, both people, although they're bound together very strongly through what they think is a good friendship, are ultimately destroying each other, because all they're doing is providing themselves with an opportunity to do evil, and evil destroys us. An example of this would be something like friends with benefits. It's utterly incompatible with charity, and it's utterly incompatible with true benevolence. On the other hand, we have worldly friendships, which ultimately emerge from a hope of gain in this world. So, for example, whenever we have networking for jobs, this would be an example of forming worldly friendships. And finally, you have true spiritual friendships, which emerge from pure charity and from the innate love of friendship alone. We don't see many of these days. In fact, they were rare even when St. Aelred was writing in the 12th century. Now, it's a lot less bad in the film when it comes to these particular relationships, because most of them are worldly, and the good thing about worldly friendships is that through conscious effort you can strive towards a better, a true form, a spiritual form of friendship through actions prescribed by St. Aelred in the book. However, again, I'd argue that Gamora and Star-Lord have an evil relationship, precisely because Gamora tries to pressure and makes Star-Lord promise to murder her if she's caught by Thanos. I don't think that there's anything that justifies this particular action. But ultimately, these people are all united together through worldly goals. They all want to defeat Thanos or defend the temporal state of humanity. That's why the Avengers formed, and the defense of particular things is ultimately why any of these things form. They're very common, but they aren't the truly transcendent, truly beautiful form of friendship that St. Aelred describes. As for the destruction of families, it's present. In fact, one of the major storylines is the stepdaughter being placed against the stepfather. To jump back to the canon, which I described at the beginning of the video, the reason why the Bible has 73 books is because the church had the authority to say so, because it is the body of Christ and Christ is God. And this is important right now, Because in this film, and indeed in most of Western society, there's no distinction made between power and authority. In fact, this is even openly discussed by the Guardians of the Galaxy characters and Thor at one point, right? So, first of all, you have Thor come in and completely subvert the authority of Star-Lord, which I understand is a running theme in the Guardians of the Galaxy films. At the same time, I can't say that it's particularly surprising that in one of the very closely subsequent scenes that Thor is describing the destruction of his family, and there's the problem with Gamora's family and all of that, because there is this conflation of power and authority, which is something that is very bad, because it leads to the resentment that you see out of Thor, and you understand, I'm sure you understand, you watching this, the kind of feelings and resentment that the breakdown of families can cause. I think that you probably know it experientially. I'd go as far as to say that. But that's the problem. Because of this conflation of authority and power, St. Aelred makes it very clear that friendship is only possible amongst equals. Yet, at the same time, the monk uses the example of Boaz and Ruth, from the Book of Ruth, who are husband and wife, as an example of great friendship. Now, of course, Thanos employs this very stereotypical view of Christianity as the man being a sort of tyrant over his daughters. And this is, of course, backed up not only by reality, because there's a lot of families that act this way, particularly those who have more of a Protestant understanding of the father being the head of the household, but also by Thanos himself. Because the film correctly understands that if there is no equality in friendship, then you can't keep things stood up. Actually, one of the more disgusting things that I've seen is the continual adoption of this particular male superiority in marriage as a result of the scriptures saying that the father is the head of the household. For example, this one that I'm going to stick up on screen, and you can read if you really want to in the description. But this, of course, contradicts St. Aelred. Now, how can this be possible? It's because when the Protestant Reformation occurred about 500 years ago, there was a conflation of power and authority. You had a number of powerful lords, which is, of course, in and of itself. The lords had lands, they had soldiers, and they overthrew the legitimate authority, which is always bestowed by God, of the Catholic Church. And we see a similar thing with Thanos. Who asked Thanos to enforce what was right? Who said that he was able to go and kill half of all life? And you see a similar thing in the implications here. Now, of course, I know that there are many people who disagree with this form of fundamentalist Protestantism, but I think that it's something that needs to be drawn attention to. However, the reaction that most people have in the modern world is to create an arguably just as bad problem. And that is to make both people in marriage completely equal in power and demolish any level of authority. Now, why would this be a problem? Because it seems, well, they're equal, aren't they? Well, because if you have a disagreement on something, and neither person is willing to back down, there's no impasse. There's no way to resolve things, there's no final say, because if both people are equal, and it's 50-50, there's no thing to break the tie, right? And so you end up with one of two situations. The first one is you end up with a divorce, which begets the kind of resentment that we see expressed in these films. And the second one is when one person enforces their will over the other, which naturally leads to resentment, because you end up with a situation where both people aren't equals. If you're enforcing the opinion over someone else, then you're naturally going to lead to resentment. So there must be someone to break the tie, and that's why the scripture argues for the husband being the head of the household. But this, of course, doesn't explain why we would accept a more compassionate view. It needs more explanation. You need to go into more detail as to how this would be compassionate to someone who is apparently lesser, an inferior partner in the relationship in the form of the wife, which is something that if you explore the scriptures you will find is in fact not the case. This is a dreadful misinterpretation that has caused the suffering of millions of men and women. We see this particularly in a homily or a commentary that's spoken on Ephesians by the 4th century patriarch of Constantinople, a fascinating man called St. John Chrysostom. And he insists that the husband should be the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church. And so he does indeed have the final say, but he must consult his wife, and as Christ did, he must empty himself and take the form of a slave and do everything that is good for his wife, even to the point of his own death, even to death on the cross. And understanding this great charity, this self-renouncement of husband who does indeed have authority but doesn't oppress his wife, indeed deeply loves her, a woman then corresponds and obeys her husband because she knows deep down that her husband is willing to die for her sake and therefore would not ask her to do anything if he wasn't completely convinced that it wasn't for her good. That is how it must be approached, because otherwise you have the problem of there being either oppression from one side of the family, or you have a problem of equality that I've just described there. Now, why is it the male specifically? Why not the woman hold this position? Well, that's actually for another video, because there's a very fascinating aspect to the Christian religion that isn't often covered, and there's a book in the description on this, and that is that Christ has come to marry his church, which is us. And Christ, being a man, marries the church, which is a woman. Which is something that would require a lot more explanation than I'm willing to put into this video. Because it's already going on for quite a while, and I think it would go over a lot of people's heads, because I can't spend all of this time putting in all of the different definitions, but it's certainly something that I'll work on if people want me to. But suffice it to say, there must be an aiming at this kind of structure. Otherwise society will just continue to collapse. We'll end up with situations where Protestants and people who are more traditionally minded will aim at increasingly more and more oppressive and ridiculous views of the family, while the progressive end will aim at equalising the family further to the point where it will cease to have any meaning. And that is when real problems are caused. There's also, in this film, an attitude towards suffering that I think the majority of people hold, but I find very alien. So, let's talk of the different attitudes. Of course, Thanos and his side are very clearly entirely apathetic to suffering. They don't care. Their aim is to wipe out half of life to somehow prevent the suffering of the other half, yet that would necessitate the suffering and death of one half. You see, it doesn't really make much sense. On the other hand, it would appear that the goodies hate all suffering if it doesn't involve some sort of sacrifice of themselves. And they utterly despise it to such a point where they will allow Thanos to have the stones to fulfill that particular part of his mission, right? It doesn't really make much sense to me. However, what I can say is that our society does have a very negative attitude towards suffering. They assume that suffering in itself is a horrendously bad thing that must be avoided at all costs, when this isn't how society or reality in fact works. Because to be utterly indifferent to suffering changes nothing. It alienates people, and it makes people feel alone. Because if you don't care about someone suffering, then they will suffer through it alone, and they might be dragged into places they don't want to go. But at the same time, hating it without reservation makes life equally miserable, because suffering is completely inevitable in our lives. We are never going to avoid it. It doesn't matter how much technology we'll ever produce, we will never ever avoid suffering, even if we're at such a point that we're sitting in the chair all day, because we will still suffer then. It is innate to human nature. However, we can mitigate our suffering and use it for good. And we're going to introduce yet another saint, Saint John of the Cross, who was a 16th century Carmelite mystic. And he wrote in his book, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, again in the description, that our sufferings come from our attachments. And in order to remove those attachments, those sinful, bad attachments, not good ones, in order to remove those bad attachments, we are going to have to suffer more, because we are attached to those things, and to rend them forth from ourselves will cause us a lot of pain in the short term, although when it's gone, it's gone. So, for example, if you have a friend that is leading you into bad situations, you might very much be bonded with them. You might experience that harmony that St. Aelred described earlier on. But at the same time, you know in your mind that this guy or girl is dragging you into situations that you don't like and also are transparently evil. So, for example, putting you in a really compromised position in a nightclub. I've seen that happen myself, and I think most of us have. You have to distance yourself from that, and that requires a level of suffering which, although maybe taken all in all, is less than would have been inflicted by the friend. In fact, that's almost certainly the case. But at the time, it will be intensely painful. But it will be for the good. But it's the same with all other habits. In the first book of this Ascent of Mount Carmel, he describes in very strong detail why these habits must be removed and why these habits will continue to cause you pain. This isn't just a company thing, of course. This is also particular habits like watching pornography. This is something that is seemingly nigh universally praised in our society, but really it's something disgusting and vile and needs to die. Because not only does it have these horrible consequences like the destruction of brain chemistry, enabling a multi-billion-dollar industry which preys on vulnerable men and women, but also destroys our entire conception of sex. It becomes as simple as almost smoking a cigarette, as opposed to the consummation of a bond, and the only means by which children are born. There are so many ways that pornography is damaging people that I'm going to link it in the description so you can read for yourself, because it's often not talked about, and it's a vicious evil that needs to be destroyed. But this applies to many things. This applies to white lies. This applies to this subjective attitude towards morality that's prevalent. This applies to you do you. This applies to any sort of immoral action that you could ever think of. This is something that needs to be worked out. It's all based on an attachment to that action, and it needs to be worked out according to St. John of the Cross, which he provides in admittedly very difficult to read detail in his book. Now, another book that you could read that will explain the sort of moral theory that I'm putting forth here, because it's all based on habit, is After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre. Because in this film, there's no mention of virtue in itself. But virtue is incredibly important to why we appreciate these characters. We appreciate them because they're the sum of their good habits. We kind of appreciate Thanos because he has this habit of sticking to the principle, regardless of whether or not the principle makes any sense or not. That fidelity to a principle that can be argued in some senses good, although isn't, is something that's attractive. Likewise, the compassion that the Avengers and the Guardians of the Galaxy have for humanity and for life, or at least they possess in some sense, right? This is a good habit. This is a virtue. But these bad habits that I've described, they are called vices. And it's coincidental that it's like a vice by the table where you hold something in place. But it's the same principle. You're held in place in something bad through vices. And this isn't talked about. And it's something that needs to be covered in a lot more detail. And I think that you can get it from that book that I've just mentioned, After Virtue by Alistair MacIntyre. If you have an Audible subscription, you can use a token to get that book, and I recommend that it will give you a much better understanding of this vice and virtue theory that we sometimes hear passed about and I've just described. Looks can be deceiving. Sometimes even popcorn flicks can say a lot about society. And this is only a small part of what that film reveals. This is mostly, of course, through its implications, and realising that the good guys and the bad guys are a false dichotomy that is founded on our own society's conception of right and wrong. But, as we've discovered, both are very flawed, and fundamentally so. A return to sanity and a return to good living can only be found in reading the ancient and medieval authors, and especially the Roman Catholic moral system, which attempts to compassionately reason our way through life, as opposed to merely using our lizard brain instincts and using cold reason without any reference to the sanctity of human life. And this must be referred to again if we expect to make our society better, to rid ourselves of these resentments that we see put forth in these films. There must be reference to this. And so I've left you with a number of resources in the description to get started. I hope you guys have found this useful. Thanks very much for watching, and please do share this with anybody who you think may gain from this. Goodbye.